Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is a very special edition of the Pod Podcast, the world's greatest podcast. This is episode number 20. And for this special occasion to ring in the new year, 2025, we have the founders of Pod Foods. We've got Larissa Russell and Fiona Lee here with us. You guys created Pod Foods, but the story doesn't start there. It actually starts in a much more humble beginnings and a really interesting story that I think would apply to a lot of folks around the industry. We've had a lot of really interesting origin stories. I call them the superhero founder origin stories. And every one of them has been unique. Every one of them has been different. Uh, this is the only one that I know of that has resulted in a new distribution platform along the way too. So that makes it interesting. But I think it'll be fun for people to hear and learn about where all of this came from and how the genesis from Pod Foods began with a cookie and from there. So I want to hand it over to you guys and maybe let's start at the beginning and hear from both of you, what inspired you in the first place to get into the cookie business? And then how did that evolve from there?
Sure. So it's not just any cookie. Peter is speaking of our original brand, which was Green Pea Cookie. And we made cookies out of roasted green peas. These are actually the original peas from one of our early trial recipes. And Fiona and I didn't know each other from before. Fiona was living in Singapore, and I was in San Francisco. It was at my first job out of school working as a data analyst in a technology startup. And I very quickly realized that it was exciting to me to follow things that would make me feel good. And one day, one of our mutual friends who was working as an intern at that business brought cookies into work, cookies from Singapore. And they were made out of green peas. And so it was a different version of this recipe that we later created. But, well, Fiona likes to say that I ate all of the cookies, and that's why we started this company, which is partially true. I did eat a lot of those cookies. And I just started to feel like this was a path forward for me somehow. I was still figuring out what I wanted to do, and that mutual friend of ours brought us together to bring these cookies to the US since the sample size of one American really enjoyed the green pea cookie recipe.
How many did you actually eat? I mean, Fiona, are we talking about dozens of cookies that she ate on that fateful day?
Yeah, tell us, Fiona.
I my guess is that she ate the whole container of green pea cookies from Singapore because there was a lot of conviction from our mutual friend at that time who was like, Americans really like green pea cookies. We have to sell this in America. And I said, if we're gonna sell a product in America, we start a company in America, we are going to need one American. And so he said, I know the perfect American, and that's Larissa. And that was really how we met. You know, we didn't see each other in person. We only met over Zoom for like, I don't know, 6 months or something like that. And then we met when I traveled from Singapore to the US for the first time. And then I had to crash with Larissa. Like I had to stay over at her apartment because, you know, she was trying to be on a budget. We were really young. We were like 22 years old, 23 years old. Stayed with Larissa in her apartment and then she kicked me out and then regretted it and then made me go back to stay with her again.
It's true. Because I wanted my own space.
Yeah.
We didn't know each other, and it was like, okay, well, I'm used to living alone. I want to be alone. But then after I kicked Fiona out and she was making ends meet in another living situation, we would work together late into the night and be talking about our cookies and all the fun things we were going to do and our Kickstarter campaign and everything like that. And then she would leave around 11 p.m. and then I would have this separation anxiety, as we used to call it, because our whole lives were made up of pea puns.
Nice. So were these cookies, was this a traditional recipe? Is this a like an age-old Singaporean traditional recipe that you brought to America for the first time?
Yeah, and I guess it has its roots in Malaysian, because we Singapore used to be a part of Malaysia, and our cultures are very similar, and so it's like kind of a powdery texture, really. So it's not like a crunchy type of cookie. It's more like a melt in your mouth. Larissa likes to say it's like a Mexican wedding cookie, something like that. So that kind of texture. We in Singapore we eat these kinds of cookies during Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, depending on how you call it. And so it's not like a everyday affair that you would eat it. It's pretty traditional.
Well, sorry. So you made the cookies, you brought them to the US, you had a Kickstarter campaign, so you were turning it into a full-blown business at this point. Where did it go from there?
So before the Kickstarter campaign, we would bake the cookies in my kitchen in San Francisco and then take them to Dolores Park, which is a park in the Mission District of San Francisco. And we would give them out as free samples and ask for feedback and use that as marketing content. And also, we collected emails so that when we launched our Kickstarter campaign, we already had a base of fans. Sent out free cookies for Christmas, that kind of thing. So it was very grassroots. And the Kickstarter campaign ended up being wildly successful from a demand perspective. But when we delivered the cookies, we learned a lot about packaging and manufacturing, and basically we were kickstarted into the food industry and all the things that we didn't know that we needed to know along the way. And long story short, we basically mailed a lot of crumbs to many customers across the world that were really excited to try the cookies. But our packaging and the way we had produced the cookies made it so that they broke in the mail.
Right. So when we had all these crumbs coming back to us, we decided to sell the crumbs to a yogurt shop or something like a frozen yogurt shop. And we
Yeah,
sold them like, I don't know, one whole giant pack.
yeah,
Like they just wanted to buy the crumbs from us. So we would break our cookies into crumbs. And then, it was just added onto toppings for their frozen yogurt. It
yeah.
was quite a big hit, actually.
And were they just called green pea cookie crumbs?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can go into the yogurt shop and you buy the green pea cookie crumbs. But so then at that point you were intentionally breaking the cookies into crumbs.
Well, we had a manufacturing hiccup that resulted in a lot of crumbs.
Which is so in other words, you had all of the same trials and tribulations that any early stage CPG founder would have learning on the fly. So what happens next? You've reached a certain amount of scale, you had these hiccups, you pivoted, you're selling crumbs. You've got the successful Kickstarter campaign though. Where do you go from there?
So at the same time as we were trying to navigate all of these hiccups, we were also aiming to optimize for scale, which was another hiccup in and of itself, because we ordered a couple literal tons of peas to be shipped over as ingredients and about 10,000 boxes of our initial packaging choice, which we thought would be great because the unit price was going down and down and down the more we purchased. But we didn't factor in the storage fees or the fact that different customers might have different opinions about what would look good on the shelf. And so, after having purchased all of this inventory, we turned through it on our online store. And it went pretty well. We had quite a bit of interest across the country from a bit of a cult following. We thought our customer base was going to be the typical young mom who wants to buy something that's more of a clean label choice for her children, sort of thing. But it ended up being gamers and people who were up late at night looking for snacks. And so we catered to them. And then eventually we realized, okay, we're moving through all of this product. It's time to enter retail stores because we were starting to get requests about, hey, where can I buy this without having to pay so much in shipping costs?
And so at that point, the idea of distribution must have come a little bit more into the forefront because you needed to figure that out before you could get into retail at scale. So at what point did you start to realize that distribution might be a bottleneck to your growth?
Well, nobody wanted to buy our cookies from us. They wanted to buy it from a distributor. So when we said to the buyer, we said, "Oh, what distributor do you work with or recommend?" And then, some people say UNFI, some just like, "Oh, the local." Like, I think at that time there was like Rainforest or some of the smaller people. And well, we tried to get in touch with UNFI. They had a program called UNFI Next. Um, and then I think we ran into so many of the paperwork and like the just like tons and tons of documents to look through, and the cost, like even just trying to understand how much money we're going to have to pay or get charged for was just like we couldn't read it. I got like kind of angry at the whole situation because there were a lot of people who wanted our cookies. They were looking for it on the shelves, and I didn't have a way that makes sense to get it there. At that time, we were in San Francisco, and it was like everybody was getting funded for any idea. It was really like quite the peak of Silicon Valley. So I was pretty inspired and angry at the same time at the whole distribution space. So one day, had the next day, I would have a morning meeting with one of the investors we were speaking with. And we were actually speaking about the cookies to that investor. And then I was thinking about distribution because I knew that the investor would ask us about how we're going to distribute our cookies. So I started thinking a lot about the distribution space. And then I took a piece of scrap paper from the table. And I remember the side of it was like our packaging and like the specifications. And I just flipped it over and I started to use a pen and I drew out like the existing distribution system as I understood it to be. And I realized that there was so much innovation from retail to consumer, especially with e-commerce like developing at that pace. This was 2017. But there wasn't any innovation at all from manufacturer into retail. Like it was just a space that was dominated by traditional old school incumbents, um, very relying on fax machines and pen and paper and things like that. So we were in Silicon Valley. It made no sense. Like there was an app for literally anything. There was an app for doing your laundry. There was an app for even picking up the poop from your pets, like things like that.
How does that work?
You just call someone through the platform and they come. So there was an app for everything, but there was no app or no technology for the most important thing, which was getting food, getting good food to consumers. And it affected the lives of every single human, right? Because everybody needs food to eat. So I drew that out and then I saw like this was $1 billion opportunity. And I called Larissa and I said, Larissa, we are going to have to shut down the cookie company and we have to do this. This is $1 billion idea. And this is what we need to do. And Larissa was like, oh, definitely. And then for the rest of that night, we didn't sleep. The next morning at about 9 a.m., we met that investor and
Well,
we
7 a.m.
7 a.m. He walked into the coffee shop. We said, sit down. Do not buy coffee. Do not say a single word. Just sit down and listen to us. We took out that scrap piece of paper and then we said, forget the cookies. This is what we're going to build into $1 billion company. And you have to invest in us. You have to, because otherwise you're not a good person. And before he walked in, 5 minutes before, Larissa said, what should the name of our company be? And that's how we came up with Pod Foods right there.
Because we used to be a green pea cookie and now we are in a pod.
Sure. No, it makes sense, and it sticks with the pun concept. But how do you, I mean, how do you make that kind of a pivot so quickly? right? Because I think a lot of people would have, definitely a lot of people would have a lot of those same frustrations about the distribution bottleneck, right? And so there's thousands of other brands over the past couple of decades that got to that same point, which is I can't scale or it's cost prohibitive to scale. I'm being bottlenecked by distribution. And a lot of those people would have the idea of there has to be a better way to do this, right? And but then it doesn't manifest into it. And I think what it sounds to me like from the outside looking in is that you just had to have the wherewithal and the courage to say that the cookie business needs to stop in order for this new business to be born, right? Because you couldn't do them both at the same time. And that takes a lot of courage because how long had you been doing the cookies at that point? When you were at that coffee shop and you told the investor that he was going to be a bad person for not investing in Pod Foods. How long had you been working in the cookies at that point?
It was about 2.5 years or 2 years.
That's a
And
long time, right? So
it
you
was a
were
long
very
time.
invested in making the cookie company into a company, and you have all this blood, sweat, and tears, and some amount of money too, and a Kickstarter campaign, and also some success too, right? Like you have a certain number of customers that love you and love the cookies and think it's awesome, right? And in order for you to do what you did, you needed to be prepared to walk away from all of that cold turkey, right? Like you immediately walked away from all of that. And that I think is what's unique. I think there's a lot of people that run into that brick wall that you ran into, but you want to hang on because it's kind of the classic sunk cost fallacy, right? Where you guys, like you had a sunk cost of 2.5 years of your life into the cookie company. And the human nature thing to do would be to say, well, I'm already in it for 2.5 years. I don't want to let go. I want to keep making the cookies. And it just seemed like that was the turning point, right? Because that like your willingness to walk away from that is what allowed you to create Pod Foods.
Yeah, we were very willing almost right away. I think the part that helped was the fact that it was the same team. So Fiona and I, throughout all of those years of trials and tribulations with the cookie business, had really gotten to know how to work together. And so it felt almost, even though it was a giant pivot, it felt like a continuation, just the next logical step. And we knew that it was a big turn, but with the cookie business, it was like, we know there's no real end in sight here. We just have to keep going. There's a lot of trust in where it was leading. And then when Fiona received this download that night, uh, we basically knew that that was the turning point. And there were a lot of details that we had to figure out over the years to get to this point. But the vision for Pod Foods really hasn't changed since that very beginning, which was to create this alternative path to retail for emerging brands. And it was more like, okay, we know what we need to do. Nobody else is going to do it, so we have to do it. Almost like when Fiona told the investor that he was going to be a bad person if he didn't invest, there was this sense of, we received this and it's up to us to do this. And there's another element there as well, which is we didn't know a lot about the industry. I mean, this was our first rodeo, was that cookie business. And so we would encounter a lot of people with tons of experience who had launched successful CPG brands using the incumbent system. And there would be certain beliefs that, if we had those beliefs, might have helped us make a better cookie business, but would not have allowed us to start the new company, Pod Foods, with as much freedom. Because we basically were starting with a clean slate with zero assumptions about how things always have worked or how the industry is supposed to work. And we could just design the system as we saw it from the ground up.
Right. So fast forward, we're now several years into the Pod Foods journey. And like you said, the mission hasn't strayed, right? The original genesis of the company was to create a next generation platform for emerging and innovative brands, right? So that's exactly what it is now. But the world has changed, though, right? I mean, we had COVID in the middle, and we've got all sorts of developments with AI, and there's all sorts of changes to how the retail landscape has played out since then. And we've got a new generation of consumers coming up with different tastes and whatnot. So, what's the next big turn, right? I mean, we started this journey, you started this journey as a cookie company that developed into a next generation distribution platform. What does this look like at maturity?
Well, I think the question that we ask ourselves all the time in our team is what works for our brand? Like what do the brands need? And I think at the very beginning when we started this company, we always placed the needs of the brands first. We thought about what it would mean for a brand to get their product from manufacturing into retail, and what was pre-manufacturing, what was during manufacturing, what was the whole like journey into the onto the shelves, and what was meant staying on the shelves. Like all of that different stages of the growth of the brand was something we always thought about, and we kept inventing new things to support the brand. So that was really important because we knew that what retailers want are just brands that sell, brands that, you know, the retailers want to make money. They want to make money from whatever is in their store. So by focusing on the brands, we were able to unlock the best value to the retailers. And so the future is the same. It continues along that same question. What will benefit the brands with AI, with data, with new technologies coming up, with more resources available? We want to use all of that to create new tools for the brands, new projects for the brands, new ways of getting to the shelves for the brands, and new ways of selling for the brands. And that whole thing is going to align incentives throughout the entire supply chain from manufacturer to distributor, us, and then to retail, and then ultimately to the consumer.
Right. And that's kind of the nice thing about that is it's a future proof concept, right? You don't need to know exactly which retailer and which categories and which trends will be in vogue 5 years from now, because as a universal concept, innovation needs to drive all of that. And so an innovation platform can pivot to whatever the whims of the market need to be.
Yeah, change is
Yes.
the only constant.
Right. Cool.
Yes, we
All right.
basically want to unlock the floodgates of innovation so that the retailers can source what consumers want, whatever that looks like. And we've had the advantage of consumers consistently looking out for better and better for you, better for the environment type of food products. And so, if we can align incentives in favor of what the consumers want, we're also opening up this new era for the food industry. Of course, the path to get here, like I said, was meandering. And when we only had 10 retail stores that were independents over in the Bay Area, it was a very different profile of brand that we could work with versus now when we have a national presence and we're consistently onboarding new enterprise scale retailers. And so doing all of that legwork and making sure that the logistics system could function to the extent possible at each individual step of the company over the years uh, basically has allowed us to this point, unlocked this point where if we had the cookie business today, we would have had the solution that we were seeking, which was to bridge that online following with offline retail and create that seamless path where the brand already has an audience. Now it can launch where its customers are and in the most strategic retailers to catapult that growth.
Right, which is a win-win for the retail. It's a win-win-win for the consumer, the retailer, and the brand, right? And the platform is just the infrastructure that runs on. But for that matter, Amazon runs on the platform of the internet, right? So there's a lot that goes into that. But I think it'll be interesting to see once the barriers to entry are removed, how much innovation can be unlocked, right? Because if you look at what goes on the restaurant side of the food business, it's relatively easy for a restaurant to create a new menu. So if there's a new ingredient like avocado toast that becomes really hot in 2015 as an ingredient, it just pops onto the menu almost immediately because there's no packaging design and bottlenecks to come up the works. But in CPG, historically there's been a lot of bottlenecks there, and the product hasn't kept up with the demand. So the consumers continue to go year after year to food away from home, as in restaurants, instead of going into CPG. And it'll be interesting to see if that pendulum starts to swing the other way now that the path to CPG innovation is clearer. Cool. Well, I mean, this is fascinating. I think it's a really interesting story. I think we could talk about it all day, but I think what's important for people to hear is that the founder's journey in CPG is always circuitous, and this is no exception. And what came out of this was something that could benefit everyone. So I'm interested to see what happens next.
Well, you're a big part of that too, Peter. So thanks for your great work with us.
Thank you.